He fed his victims to his dogs. Those words landed in the town like a stone thrown into still water. At first, people refused to believe it. It sounded like a rumor, a grotesque exaggeration you might hear in a dark bar late at night. But the truth, when it came into focus, was far more chilling because it showed how ordinary life can hide dangerous things. This first part of the story is about how small details, patient police work, and a community's uneasy instincts slowly pulled a terrible pattern into the open. In the weeks after the first disappearances, neighbors described the accused the way people usually describe someone in a small town. He kept to himself. He looked neat. He did his shopping at the same stall each week. Children who passed his house noticed the big dogs chained in the yard. Parents said he waved politely. He was the sort of man you might nod to on the street and then forget. That ordinary face is part of what made the later revelations so hard to accept. When violence comes from someone who looks and acts normal, the world feels less safe because it removes the easy categories we use to understand danger. The case began not with a dramatic break, but with questions and gaps. A child did not come home. A young woman stopped answering her phone after work. A laborer didn't show up for his shift. Those are the kinds of reports any police department receives, sometimes daily. Most of the time they end in relief. Someone was delayed, or a family member had a reason they could not call back. But a few of these reports did not close. Nights passed, posters went up, volunteers organized search parties. The ordinary rhythms of town life, school runs, market mornings, evening prayers, were interrupted by a growing unease. Detectives, especially those who have worked long enough in small communities, learn to notice patterns that might otherwise look like unrelated events. A missing bicycle here, a broken gate there, a neighbor who suddenly moves away. None of these are definitive proof of anything on their own. Taken together, though, they can form a map that points to something wrong. In this case, the questions were simple. Had any stranger been seen in the area? Had anyone changed their routine? Who had new wounds or fresh excuses for blood on clothing? The work was tedious and detailed, checking CCTV where it existed, interviewing shopkeepers who might have sold a pair of gloves, tracing rental records for cars seen near the scenes. It was patient work, and patience is often what solves these puzzles. People in the town remember the moment suspicion moved from rumor into something more concrete. A preschool teacher did not ignore her unease. She noticed a man sitting near the school in a car, watching too intently. It was the kind of small, awkward thing a person might dismiss. Perhaps he was waiting for a friend, but she felt something wrong, and crucially, she wrote down his license plate number. That small act, a detail some might see as inconsequential, would later become a hinge in the investigation. It's worth saying that many investigations are advanced by similar, simple acts. An attentive neighbor, a clerk who remembers a small transaction, a driver who happens to clock a plate number. As police followed the threads, another element turned up that linked places and times in a way that seemed unlikely to be coincidence. Forensic analysts, when they could be brought in, looked at items left at scenes, bindings, footprints, the types of knots used to tie bundles. In one case, the rope used to bind a victim was not the kind of rope a typical household would have. Its make and stitching suggested a specialized source. That detail, small and technical, mattered because it could be traced. In towns where high-tech forensics are harder to access, these sorts of tangible, traceable items can be the most valuable evidence. They give investigators a lead that goes beyond memory and hearsay. At the same time, detectives spent time building a picture of the man who would eventually be accused. What emerged was a contradiction that bothered many. Outwardly, he was a tidy man who worked steadily and participated in small ways in his community. But there were also hints of isolation. People who had known him for years recalled that he did not have close friends and that he rarely invited anyone into his home. He was described as methodical, someone who liked order and who seemed to prefer control in the small things of life. That personality, combined with access to tools and to a job that required traveling quietly at odd hours, created the template investigators feared they might find. Someone whose outward life masked deeper problems. The discovery that tied some cases together did not rely on one dramatic revelation. It came through a combination of careful witness interviews, small forensic matches, and the kind of dogged cross-checking that can seem boring until the moment it pays off. A rental record here, a dental impression there, a fiber that matched cloth from an earlier scene. Taken individually, these might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a net. And when police began to move on warrants, the town watched. Some people watched with disbelief. Others watched with a kind of slow relief. Accusations are never easy in small places because they ripple outward. Families and livelihoods can be affected, reputations strained. Yet justice requires that authorities follow the evidence, even when it points to someone who once seemed ordinary. Once authorities arrested the man, the narrative changed in ways many had not expected. In interviews with investigators and later in court proceedings, he spoke with a calmness that unnerved many who listened. He did not offer the wild justifications one might find in fiction. Instead, parts of his testimony were unsettling in their ordinary tone. Recollections of routines, specific descriptions of how he prepared for days away from home, and, in some recounting, a lack of remorse that influenced how prosecutors and psychiatrists would interpret his actions. Experts later assessed him and noted a pattern of obsessive behavior, difficulties with emotional connection, and a tendency to plan. Those assessments do not excuse harm. Rather, they help explain, in a measured way, how someone with a regular life could commit repeated violence. We need to be careful here about how we speak of harm. This story involves people who lost family members and friends, and our language must respect their pain. The way the case was discussed in town, in markets, at church, and around dinner tables, was not abstract. It was personal and practical. Parents changed the routes their children took to school. Neighbors formed watch groups, and friends who once left a porch light on all night began to lock their doors. That response is important because it shows how communities adapt. It also shows how a town, when shaken, can still find ways to protect itself and to demand answers. By the time this first part of the story closes, 2 points stand out. First, most investigations are a mosaic of small facts that fit together slowly. There is rarely a single dramatic moment that solves everything. Second, people matter. The watchful neighbor, the teacher who wrote down a plate number, the detectives who did the quiet work of comparison. Those are the details that shift a case from rumor to proof. In the next part of this series, we will follow how investigators used those small facts to connect scenes across regions, how expert testimony entered the picture, and how families coped as the truth moved from suspicion to a formal charge. For now, hold on to the sense that this story is not only about crime, but also about the fragile trust that holds a community together, and what happens to that trust when the ordinary becomes the unimaginable. People in Ningxia still talk about it, how long it took for the truth to surface, even while the man everyone now calls the butcher moved through life like nothing was wrong. In the early stages of the investigation, police did not yet know they were chasing a repeat offender. They only knew several disappearances were starting to form a shape. And that shape pointed to someone who watched people carefully, someone who understood the quiet parts of daily life well enough to slip between them unnoticed. After the first arrest, detectives began the slow, uncomfortable work of retracing his steps. The man they had in custody showed a strange mix of cooperation and distance. He didn't resist questioning, but he rarely volunteered more than a few words at a time. Officers described him as calm, almost detached, as if the seriousness of the situation hadn't reached him. That composure bothered everyone in the room. Experienced investigators know that people react differently under pressure, But this man's stillness felt unnatural, like he had rehearsed it for years. The first major task was mapping his movements. Investigators pulled phone records, travel logs, and work schedules. He had held several small jobs that allowed him to move around village borders without raising suspicion. Most days he returned early, claiming he didn't like noise or crowds. His house sat on the edge of a neighborhood where people mostly kept to themselves. Nobody questioned his habits. In smaller communities, privacy is often more respected than curiosity. But as police dug deeper, they noticed inconsistencies. His stated work hours didn't match his employer's notes. His phone was switched off during several key times when victims disappeared. And his neighbors remembered something small but telling. The man went out late at night more often than anyone realized. They assumed he was simply walking his dogs, two large animals that seemed to be the center of his daily routine. Those dogs became an important thread very quickly. They were unusually aggressive, territorial, and always hungry. People avoided walking too close to his yard because the dogs lunged at the fence whenever someone passed. At the time, nobody thought it was strange. Some people just preferred guard dogs. But after his arrest, the animals suddenly felt like a metaphor for the man himself. Quiet on the surface, dangerous beneath. Detectives obtained a warrant to search his home, and this was the moment the case moved from suspicion to certainty. His property was small, kept in an orderly but cold way. Rooms were neat and plain. No personal decorations, no family photos, nothing warm or lived in. Investigators said it felt like a place meant for function, not comfort. Even the kitchen was arranged with precise spacing, as if everything had been measured. Then came the backyard.
The officers who entered it later described an immediate sense of unease. The ground held patches of disturbed soil. Nothing dramatic, just subtle signs of digging and refilling. The dog pens were reinforced with fencing stronger than what an average pet owner would use. There were hooks on the walls, heavy gloves, and a large bucket that smelled unpleasant, but not in a way that suggested decay, more like a place where messy work had been done repeatedly. Inside a small shed, police found tools. Most were ordinary farm tools, the kind anyone living in a rural area might own. But there were also items that seemed out of place, like lengths of rope carefully coiled, rolls of tape, and a locked metal box with multiple keys on a ring. When they finally opened that box, they found a collection of small personal belongings, jewelry, a broken watch, a hair clip. Items that, taken alone, meant nothing, but placed together formed a pattern that no officer could ignore. Each item matched reports from families who'd lost someone. This was the moment when the investigation shifted from a search to a confirmation. Detectives returned to question the man again, this time with more pressure. They asked where he went late at night, what he kept in the shed, and why certain objects were found arranged so neatly. His answers were short and vague. He claimed to walk his dogs for exercise. He said the shed held tools for repairs. He insisted the belongings in the metal box were simply things he'd found around the neighborhood. His tone remained steady, but officers noticed something new. He avoided eye contact whenever the dogs were mentioned. Over the next days, interviews with neighbors added more layers. Several recalled hearing barking late at night, loud, frantic barking, followed by sudden quiet. Others said they had seen him carrying heavy bags from his car to the yard at odd hours. A few insisted they smelled smoke or strange odors drifting across the fences, but they never reported it because the man always seemed polite, even soft-spoken. People didn't associate him with danger. The police now suspected he knew exactly how to move through the blind spots of small-town life, keeping to himself, staying polite, creating just enough distance so people saw him as private rather than suspicious. It's a pattern many serial offenders share, blending in so smoothly that people realize the truth only after it is too late. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they noticed something chilling. The man's activities seemed almost scheduled. There were consistent days when he vanished for hours. There were clear gaps in his work attendance that matched dates when people went missing. He had built a routine that allowed him to appear responsible while concealing a darker second life. When confronted with this information, his expression did not crack. Instead, he sat back, folded his hands, and said softly, "You're mistaken." But detectives knew he was lying. They had enough evidence for a formal charge, yet they wanted more, something that would explain the motive, the reason for such calculated harm. That answer came unexpectedly. During a psychological evaluation, the specialist assigned to him observed something unusual. He seemed more attached to his dogs than to any human being. He spoke about them with a warmth he didn't show elsewhere. He described feeding them early in the morning, brushing their coats, even sleeping near them when storms frightened the animals. They were, in his words, the only companions that understood him. This detail alarmed the specialist. It suggested a deep emotional imbalance, a replacement of human connection with something primal. The evaluator wrote in his report that the man displayed signs of isolation, an obsessive need for control, and a disturbing disregard for human life. But even that didn't fully explain the darkest part of the case: how the dogs were involved. Detectives were turned to the backyard to search again, this time with specialized teams. Soil samples, fence marks, feeding containers, everything was examined. Piece by piece, the truth unfolded. The shed, the disturbed ground, the late-night outings, the dog's unusual behavior. It all pointed to the same conclusion, one that investigators struggled to accept, even as evidence confirmed it. The man wasn't just harming people. He was using his dogs in ways no community, no family, no parent wanted to imagine. The town's fear changed into something deeper: outrage. People demanded answers. Families of missing victims gathered outside the station, hoping for closure. Reporters arrived asking questions that officers weren't ready to answer. And through all of this, the accused remained silent, as though the world unraveling outside had nothing to do with him. By the end of Part 2, one truth became clear. The man had built an entire hidden routine. He used privacy as a shield. He used his animals as a mask. And he operated in the quiet spaces between people's trust, where danger can grow unnoticed. But in Part 3, those quiet spaces disappear. The investigation explodes into the open when one final discovery forces the authorities to confront the full scale of what he had done and how many families were still waiting for answers. Fear had already settled over Ningxia by the time investigators returned to the suspect's home for a more thorough search. People were whispering in markets, watching their children more closely, locking doors earlier in the evening. Rumors moved faster than official reports, and every rumor made the man seem more monstrous than the last. Still, the police needed something solid, something that would stand in court, not just frighten a town. That proof arrived because of a mistake the suspect never realized he'd made. A team of forensic specialists was called in from the provincial capital. They brought equipment that the small local station didn't have: better soil analysis tools, more precise scanners, and experts trained to read environmental traces. These specialists combed through the suspect's backyard, the shed, even the narrow gaps along the fence line. Nothing was overlooked. One officer noticed the dogs seemed unusually restless whenever the investigators approached the far corner of the yard. They growled, paced, and pulled at their chains. It wasn't the behavior of animals simply protecting their territory. It was more like anxiety, almost as if they remembered something about that space. So the specialists focused their attention there. They dug carefully, a few inches at a time.
They sifted soil, measured moisture patterns, and studied the way the earth had settled. It wasn't the holes themselves that mattered. It was what the soil revealed. Repeated disturbance over months, possibly years. The ground carried traces that didn't belong in a normal backyard. Inside the shed, a second team looked deeper into the metal box found earlier. Every object inside it, the jewelry, the hair clip, the broken watch, was photographed and cataloged. Investigators knew these were personal items likely connected to missing people. But now a new detail emerged. Several items had faint marks, not scratches, but indentations. These marks were compared with tools found in the shed, and some matched exactly. This man wasn't just collecting things. He was keeping small pieces of his victims as reminders. That discovery shook the detectives. Souvenirs mean one thing in criminal psychology. The offender likes to return to the memory of the crime, to relive it. It suggested a level of planning and intention that made prosecuting him easier, but made understanding him far more frightening. As evidence grew, the investigators decided to re-interview everyone who lived near the suspect. They spread out through the community, knocking on doors, asking questions again. People who had been hesitant before now felt freer to speak. Fear makes people honest, and honesty moves investigations forward. One elderly neighbor said she had seen the man digging late at night. She assumed he was planting something, maybe burying waste, but the hours were strange, usually after midnight. Another neighbor recalled seeing him drive away with heavy bags in his car trunk. He returned hours later, without them. When asked why she never reported this before, she said the same thing many people said. "He looked so normal. I thought it wasn't my place to interfere." This was the tragedy of small towns. Politeness sometimes overrides instinct. Meanwhile, investigators analyzed the man's work records again. That's when they found a timetable that startled them. His job required early morning travel through rural routes, the kind of isolated paths where nobody paid attention to passing vehicles. There were repeated gaps, always on days connected to disappearances. It looked like a pattern disguised as routine. Investigators presented this timeline to the man during questioning. They expected panic or denial or anger. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and said nothing. No explanation, no attempt to defend himself. His silence was not a confession, but it wasn't innocence either. The detectives knew they were dealing with someone who believed he could control the narrative simply by withholding words. Then something unexpected happened. A family from a nearby district arrived at the station. They explained that they had lost a daughter months earlier. She was last seen near a rural road, not far from where the suspect often drove. When they saw his face on the news, they felt a cold recognition. But what made them come forward wasn't his face. It was one of the items the police had shown on television. A hair clip. It was identical to one their daughter had worn every day.
This was the emotional moment the investigation had lacked. A direct connection between the suspect and a missing person, something that could not be explained away or dismissed. Investigators brought the family in, compared their description with the item in the metal box, and confirmed it. This placed the suspect near their daughter on the day she vanished. But if one case was connected to him, others likely were too. Detectives returned to the suspect's home one more time, this time with stronger legal authority and a larger team. They searched the interior again, the small bedroom, the dresser drawers, the cramped kitchen, and found something that chilled even the seasoned officers. In a drawer under his bed, they located a notebook. The cover was worn, and the pages were filled with numbers, dates, and short-coded notes. At first, it looked like financial calculations or random scribbling, but when cross-checked with dates of disappearances, the entries lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. This notebook became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire case. It proved intent, planning, and the presence of a pattern that stretched much farther back than anyone had imagined. When detectives confronted him with the notebook, he reacted for the first time. He asked to see it. They placed it on the table. He looked at the pages for a long time.
his fingers brushing the edges. Then he closed it gently and said one sentence: "You still don't understand." That sentence changed everything, because it suggested something far darker, that what investigators had uncovered so far was not the full story. There were earlier victims, or more locations, or something else they had not even considered yet. The lead detective left that interview with a sinking feeling. The man wasn't just hiding details. He believed there were things the police wouldn't find at all. And he was almost right. What happened next occurred by luck, not strategy. A young officer reviewing drone images of the suspect's property noticed a strange discoloration in the soil a few meters beyond the dog pens. This area hadn't been inspected earlier because it seemed too close to the fence line and outside the main area of interest, but the drone image suggested otherwise. When investigators returned to dig there, what they found revealed the full scale of the man's hidden life. Not graphic remains, but something else. Something that proved beyond doubt how the suspect had used that part of the yard and what purpose the dog served. This discovery was the turning point for the entire town. It turned fear into shock, shock into outrage, and outrage into the pressure that finally pushed the case into its final phase. The discovery behind the dog pens spread through Ningxia faster than any official announcement. People didn't know the exact details, but they sensed the weight of it from the sudden increase in police cars, the taped-off perimeter, and the way officers moved with urgency rather than caution. Something major had shifted, something that proved the man in custody had been hiding far more than anyone imagined. Inside the station, investigators sat around a long table covered in reports, photos, timelines, and statements. For weeks they had gathered puzzle pieces, unsure how many there were or what the final picture would look like. Now they had enough pieces to see the outline clearly, and it was far bigger than the handful of cases they originally suspected. The drone images that helped them find the backyard hotspot were taken almost as an afterthought. A young officer was practicing with the equipment and decided to map the entire property from above. It was only when he zoomed in on the screen later that the discoloration caught his eye. It was subtle, a patch of soil that absorbed sunlight differently, a sign it had been disturbed repeatedly. That small observation led to the breakthrough. Forensic specialists moved in again, this time focusing on testing the soil itself. What they found confirmed the worst timeline investigators feared. The suspect had been disposing of evidence in that corner for far longer than the known cases. The chemicals in the soil showed patterns consistent with long-term disposal activities, stretching back years, not months.
When investigators looked at the man's notebook with this new information, the coded entries finally made sense. The numbers were not random. They represented dates, the weather on those days, and short references to the same secluded areas he often traveled to. Some entries matched the dates of missing person reports. Some matched none at all, suggesting cases nobody had connected to him yet. This changed the entire investigation overnight. Police departments from other districts arrived to compare their cold cases. Families from neighboring provinces called the station, wondering if the man could be linked to disappearances they had never found answers for. It became clear that Ningxia was not the only place touched by his crimes. He had used his quiet lifestyle and his job routes to move in ways nobody had tracked before. But what terrified people most was not how far he had traveled. It was how close he had always been. Most offenders avoid attention, but this man perfected the art of invisibility. He worked simple jobs, answered people politely, kept his yard tidy, and never allowed anyone to come too close. He used silence as a shield, and the dogs as another layer of protection. Anyone who approached his property was scared off by the aggressive barking. Anyone who might have questioned his late-night habits assumed he was simply feeding or training the animals. That was how he operated, behind a curtain of normal behavior. When news spread that investigators believed there might be many victims, far more than the town had counted, fear turned into public anger. Families demanded transparency. Press gathered outside the police station. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions. Why didn't anyone see this earlier? How could a man like this operate for years without being stopped? How many victims were there really? The police chief, exhausted from weeks without proper sleep, held a press briefing. He didn't offer numbers, he didn't speculate, but he did confirm what the town feared. We believe the suspect is linked to multiple disappearances over several years. That single sentence felt like a shockwave. People cried openly in the crowd. Some shouted accusations at the station. Others simply stood still, absorbing the reality that someone who lived among them, someone they passed in markets and saw on the street, had been capable of this. Inside the station, investigators faced the daunting task of connecting cases across time. They separated the notebook entries into clusters, matching them to regional reports. When a pattern repeated, same day of the week, same time of night, same route, they flagged it. The board in the briefing room filled quickly. Town names, dates, ages, circumstances, and every new match tugged at the hearts of officers who had been working the case from the start. The emotional toll was heavy. Detectives spoke later about the atmosphere in that room, the silence after each new match, the quiet sighs, the shared glances that said more than words. Even seasoned officers struggled. It's one thing to investigate one tragic disappearance. It's another to realize you're looking at a long chain of lives interrupted, families forever marked. The turning point came when they revisited a case from years earlier, one that originally had no suspects. A young woman traveling alone had vanished near a rural bus stop. Her belongings were never found. The only detail witnesses remembered was seeing a man with two large dogs walking not far from the road that afternoon. At the time, it seemed unrelated. Many rural residents walked dogs near fields. It was not unusual. But now, with everything the police had uncovered, that memory became a match. When investigators brought this up to the suspect, his expression changed for the second time. Not fear, not guilt, something much stranger. Recognition, almost like he had forgotten that particular event and was quietly filing it back into his mind. Before they could press further, he said something no one expected. "There are places you haven't looked." The lead detective froze. Those words suggested hidden sites, hidden evidence, possibly hidden victims. Investigators asked him to explain. He didn't. He simply repeated, "You haven't looked everywhere." This statement forced authorities to bring in search teams from all surrounding areas. They combed through isolated fields, abandoned buildings, and riverbanks the suspect might have visited based on his notebook entries. Day after day, they searched, and while they didn't find physical remains, something too sensitive and too disturbing to imagine, they did find evidence of the man's presence: burned cloth, rope fragments, items that matched missing persons' belongings. These discoveries expanded the timeline even further. By week's end, investigators estimated the suspect had been active for almost a decade. Word of this spread quickly, and the community's grief deepened. Families who once believed their missing loved ones might return had to face a different reality. Some came to the station in tears, clutching photos, hoping for answers. Officers sat with them, listening, comforting, doing their best to match memories to evidence. One mother asked a detective, "Did he hurt her?" The detective paused, aware of the emotional weight. He didn't give specifics. Instead, he said something simple and compassionate. "We believe she didn't suffer long." The case became more than an investigation. It became a mirror showing the community how important vigilance is, how every unusual moment matters, how silence can hide shadows.
When the suspect was finally brought into the courtroom, the air inside felt heavy. People filled every seat. Some had arrived before sunrise just to witness the first day. Families of the missing sat in one row, their hands tight around tissue packets, their eyes fixed on the man who had quietly shaped years of their grief. Reporters crowded the back, their notebooks open, recorders ready. The entire region seemed to pause. Ningxia had waited too long for answers, and now They wanted them spoken out loud. The man walked in slowly, with the same calmness he'd shown during interrogation. No panic, no anger. His face was blank, almost detached. To many sitting in the courtroom, that expression felt like an insult, as if he were attending someone else's trial. But to investigators who knew his behavior, this wasn't surprising. He always hid behind silence. Control was his shield, and he wanted everyone to know he was still holding it. Before the trial officially began, the judge reminded the room that emotions could not interfere with the legal process. But that was easier said than done. Every family in that room carried years of fear, confusion, and heartbreak. Their children, siblings, or parents had disappeared without explanations. Now, the courtroom was the only place left where they might find closure. The prosecution opened with a careful timeline. They didn't start with the darkest details. Instead, they began with the early disappearances that the town had once dismissed as isolated events. They showed how each case, when placed beside the others, formed a chilling pattern. The same routes, the same days of the week, the same locations where the suspect's phone went dark, the same missing belongings later found in his metal box. Then they presented the notebook, the coded entries that had cracked the case open. Page after page, the court saw the dates, the notes, and the strange symbols the suspect had written. A forensics expert explained how the timeline matched the nights the suspect left his job early, the nights neighbors saw him carrying bags, the nights the dogs barked longer than usual. The courtroom was silent the entire time. You could hear every turn of the notebook's pages. When the prosecution mentioned the backyard evidence, the judge ordered people to stay calm. A few gasps still echoed through the room. No graphic details were needed. The facts spoke for themselves. The soil, the shed, the tools, the reinforced pens. Every piece pointed to a man who had built a routine of cruelty behind ordinary walls. Witnesses followed one after another. A neighbor described hearing the dogs late at night, their frantic barking followed by sudden quiet. A shopkeeper spoke about the suspect buying heavy bags and rope, more than the average person would ever need. The preschool teacher, the one who wrote down the license plate that first triggered suspicion, took the stand too. She explained how she'd noticed the man sitting near the school, staring at children, with an expression she couldn't describe but couldn't forget. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but she stayed steady. People in the audience silently thanked her. Without her caution, the case might have gone untouched much longer. One of the most emotional moments came when families of victims testified. They held photos, some faded from time. They described the last day they saw their loved ones, the routines they once took for granted, the nights they waited by doors or stayed awake listening for footsteps that never came. The court allowed short, respectful statements. The families didn't need long speeches. Their grief was already a story, one everyone understood without explanation. The defense tried its best, but their arguments fell flat. They suggested coincidence. They suggested the notebook entries could be interpreted in many ways. They even suggested the man's calmness was a sign of misunderstanding, not guilt. But with each piece of evidence presented, their arguments collapsed. Too many points connected, too many patterns matched. Too many lives had been interrupted along the same line. When it was the man's turn to speak, he stood quietly and looked at the judge. The courtroom held its breath. He didn't deny anything. He didn't confess either. He simply said, "I did what I did. The reasons won't change anything." It was the first time many people in the room heard his voice. It was flat, almost tired. Not angry, not ashamed, just empty. That emptiness cut deeper than anything else. It confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Remorse was not something he felt. Control was. And even now, facing a courtroom full of broken families, he clung to that control by choosing silence over explanation. After weeks of testimony, the final day came. The judge read the verdict in a voice that carried across every corner of the room. Guilty on all major charges. Guilty on multiple counts connected to disappearances. Guilty on every charge supported by evidence. There was no dramatic outburst, no cheering, no shouting, just quiet tears, hands held tightly, heads bowed. The families finally had answers, even if they were painful. Justice did not erase anything, but it offered a place to begin healing. The sentencing followed. The judge spoke about the seriousness of the crimes, the long-lasting damage to families, and the fear that spread through Ningxia. He mentioned how someone who appeared ordinary had betrayed the trust of an entire community. In the end, the man received one of the harshest sentences allowed by the law, a sentence that guaranteed he would never leave prison again. For investigators, the trial was both a victory and a burden. They had solved the case, but the weight of what they uncovered didn't vanish. Several officers said they struggled to sleep for weeks afterwards, replaying interviews, remembering the moment the notebook was found, recalling the quiet sentences the suspect spoke. As for the town, life slowly moved back to normal. Children returned to walking to school, markets reopened with their usual noise, but something inside the community had changed. People became more watchful, more willing to speak up if something felt wrong. The simple act of writing down a license plate had saved lives, and the town never forgot it. The dogs were placed under the care of specialists, evaluated carefully, and moved far from the town. Their lives, too, had been shaped by the man's darkness. The court recognized that they were animals pulled into something they never chose. In the months after the trial, memorials were held. Families gathered to remember the ones they lost. Candles were lit along quiet streets, and community leaders spoke about healing, unity, and vigilance. The case became a lesson passed down from neighbors to children. Trust your instincts, protect your community, and never overlook small signs. In the end, the butcher of Ningxia was not remembered for the horrors he created, but for the strength of the people who stopped him. A teacher who followed her instincts, detectives who refused to give up, and families who demanded answers even when it was painful. This is how the story closes. Not with fear, but with clarity. Not with darkness, but with the courage of ordinary people who paid attention when it mattered most. And in Ningxia, the echoes of that courage still live on.